All right, here we go. Kinesiology 230. This is still chapter 3. This is presentation number 10. This is the last presentation in the series. We're talking about substrate depletion and repletion, meaning replenishment. And we're going to jump into a little bit of oxygen uptake and aerobic and anaerobic contributions to exercise. So substrates are the molecules providing the starting materials for reactions. We've talked about phosphagens, glucose, glycogen in the blood and the muscle, lactate, free fatty acids, and amino acids. So if we just kind of broad-based look at this, we had the phosphagen system, then we had the glycolysis system. You had a byproduct that was lactate, and that was determined if pyruvate could go into the Krebs cycle or not. If pyruvate could not go into the Krebs cycle, it was converted and sent as lactate to the liver and processed through the Cori cycle. And then free fatty acids and amino acids were broken up through oxidative process. So you kind of look broad-based, you can see the three energy systems represented here with these different energy substrates. Excuse me. With glycogen, when you first work out and you have a tough workout, your body craves carbohydrates because it wants to replenish the energy post-exercise. And you have to do that within the first 45 minutes or so, to be quite honest. And that's going to be more like simple carbohydrates just to kind of replenish the supply. But then what ends up happening is during the next 5 or 6 hours of recovery, you have to start to you have to continue with that theme of offering carbohydrates to the muscles to be able to replenish glycogen. And the book lists that it's optimal when the ingestion is 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight. You can do the math on your own body weight as you're listening to me talk about this, about every 2 hours after exercise. So when you look at glycogen storage within the body is limited to about 500 grams or about 2,000 calories. So one can make the argument of how much you actually depleted and then how many calories you actually have to ingest. And the replenishment of glycogen itself, it does occur fairly rapidly, but you also have to be systematic about replenishing glycogen. Okay, so oxygen uptake, and oxygen deficit and oxygen debt. These are three easily confused concepts, and I just want to shine a light to them because the book has a couple of charts and graphs about them, and I know there's a couple of questions. Oxygen uptake is the measure of the ability to take in and use oxygen. And in the chart to the right, we have a couple things going on, but I'm going to read through the left here, but then we'll jump a little bit further into the chart to the right. With oxygen deficit, it's energy that is provided at the start of exercise is anaerobic. And so there's an oxygen deficit. We know because, as we talked about, the oxidative system isn't called to action right away. Even when a person is running a distance race, what is first brought into play is the phosphagen system. That system is called to action and it's anaerobic in nature. So what ends up happening is you have the amount of oxygen that's required to operate or exercise at that level, denoted by the dotted line. But you know that you're anaerobic to start off because that's the predominant energy system that helps you even in a steady state exercise as represented here as they show 15 minutes of exercise. So you run a deficit to start. That's the difference between these two. And that gets tighter and tighter and tighter as you get to steady state as we transition and we do the handshake, if you will, or the overlap between the charts like we saw before from the phosphagen system to the glycolytic system, to the aerobic system. And then when you get to the aerobic system, then you have no trouble making ATP for your body, for your muscles, excuse me. Now, oxygen debt or exercise post-exercise oxygen consumption, EPOC, is what happens when you stop exercise and you go through recovery. Your body is still requiring or still needs oxygen over and above its normal resting rate. And that happens over a predetermined amount of time. Some people can recover faster than others. Now, I will ask you to take a quick moment here and we'll look at these side by side. And when you look at these two, you have steady state exercise, 15 minutes, exercise done for 1 minute. So 1 minute tells you that we're kind of in the glycolytic window, right? We're not really in the oxidative window here, but over here we are. And you can look at the difference between the charts, right? So we have our steady state exercise and the VO2 required for exercise, and we have our VO2 max. So we have VO2 max, and we don't really work ourselves hard enough to get to or need to push to our full VO2 max. Now, what happens though when we have high intensity exercise, we have the same oxygen deficit kind of curve mentality and same concept, but because it's a higher intensity exercise, that deficit is much greater. As a matter of fact, if you look at this, the dotted line here that they show is the person's VO2 max, where over here the dotted line is the VO2 required for the exercise. So there's a difference between these two charts, and the nuance is important because when you look at this, it's inferring that the person is working under their VO2 max, whereas over here the person is working over their VO2 max. They're working at an intensity higher than their VO2 max, and as a result, the oxygen deficit is greater in that scenario. Now, I'm going to pause this for 1 second and bring up another chart that might look familiar. Yeah, so this is back from presentation 6, and you think back in terms of, all right, we have onset blood lactate accumulation, and then you have this kind of steady state that we operate at, and that steady state, if I can just scoop back one here, is about 0.5 to 2.2 millimoles at rest. And then you have lactate production increases with exercise intensity, but you see that this onset blood lactate accumulation, that happens in untrained subjects at roughly about 60% of maximal oxygen uptake, and individuals, if I can get over here, and individuals who are in better shape, that pushes the curve to the right and gives us a different plot point on our graph, and that individual is closer to like 80%. So now if we get out of this, close it out, and we go back to the other chart that we had, you start to look at this in terms of pushing the curve to the right on the other chart, and you look at what happens in terms of our workloads. Steady state, perhaps, if you want to just kind of juxtaposition the two. Yeah, and just for sake of keeping things simple and not having to switch back and forth, what it is, I just cut and pasted that one chart or graph, excuse me, into this slide. Steady state exercise, 15 minutes. This is high intensity exercise, 1 minute or less. Here we're working under our VO2 max, excuse me. Here we're working over our VO2 max. And over here we're talking about lactate threshold, roughly about 50%. And then you have onset blood lactate accumulation, where you have this accumulation of lactate in the blood itself. And as we've noted, the fitter the person is, the more it shifts to the right in terms of the onset of blood lactate accumulation. So there's a couple of things at play here, and you have to kind of think back through some of our presentations and through some of the charts in the book. But the big takeaway that I want you to have from this is as follows. In this first one, notice the oxygen deficit. It's much smaller because you're working under your VO2 max, which would be represented over here at 100%. Here, your oxygen deficit is much greater because you're working above what would be your VO2 max, because the VO2 required for the exercise is much higher. So you're above your 100% in this chart over here. And so just again, juxtaposition these two and think of somebody who's untrained versus somebody who's trained, and how that curve gets pushed further and further to the right and becomes more pronounced in terms of its steepness of slope, or becomes hyperbolic if you want to think of it in terms of graphical terms. So just kind of compare those three and kind of wrap yourself around it. But the big thing you have here is oxygen deficit, oxygen debt, and then if I go back a slide, you have oxygen uptake. All right, just kind of wrap yourself around those three terms, and I think you'll be safe on the exam. With that, guys, I'm signing off. Have a good one.